Class, this is the first of the lecture videos that I will be making specifically for SOC 220 as we transition to being fully online in light of the coronavirus pandemic. These videos will obviously not be a perfect replacement of in class lectures. For one thing, they will be decidedly less engaging or interactive, but they also are not going to be as long. I will indicate several points in the lecture where I will not be covering the material, largely just because I would be regurgitating the information from the book, and so therefore it's not necessary. But there will be some parts of the lecture where I will be building in additional material and information, and so I will spend a little bit more time on those slides. In order to make it a little easier for you to engage with the videos, I will do my best to keep them within about 15 to 25 minutes. And so, therefore, Chapter 8 will be split into a couple of sections. So, just beginning with what our objectives are for this chapter, you're going to want to be able to explain what a drug is, and the different factors such as culture, race, ethnicity, that can affect how a society views drug use. Like our other social problems, this social problem does come with a certain level of subjectivity. You're going to want to be able to distinguish drug use from drug abuse, as well as addiction from dependency. You're going to need to know some kind of basic information about the different types of drugs. This is the part where, although I provided you slides, I will not be going over those slides in the video. You're going to want to analyze the connection between drugs and various social problems. You're summarize the effectiveness of various drug control strategies. Apply sociological theory to issues involving drugs, and then analyze drug related issues from the various positions on the political spectrum. Those last couple of points will be in a later video. So, beginning with just what the definition of a drug is. A drug is any chemical substance other than food or water that has some type of effect on the mind or body. Although we oftentimes subjectively kind of perceive drugs, or we associate the term drug in a negative fashion, this obviously is not always the case. Drugs can be defined as good or as harmful. Think of life-saving medicines, or even over-the-counter drugs that help us with our various aches and pains. How a drug is perceived or defined can vary based on culture. So the definitions of drugs can vary from one society to the next. So, for instance, alcohol, which is a drug, largely doesn't have much of a negative connotation or perception in most Western societies. It plays a large part in Western culture, and even America, where our legal drinking age is 21. This is a later drinking age than in some of our European counterparts, where the drinking age is much younger, and especially with something like wine, young people are exposed to it, and drink it as part of their meal at much earlier ages. Peyote is a hallucinogen, and it's used in religious rituals among Native Americans. And coca, which we associate with cocaine, has a variety of uses in South America, although it also used to be readily accepted in a variety of uses here in America as well. So I give you an example of cocaine toothache drops, or that we know that the original Coca-Cola formula used to have small amounts of coca in it. And so this just emphasizes that, in addition to the fact that the definition of what is a drug and how drugs are perceived vary across cultures, this perception of a drug also can vary across time. And a good example of that, of course, is alcohol. Alcohol was important in colonial America. This largely reflects, our kind of Western civilization, kind of cultural background. However, immigration changed public view of alcohol, and this just shows you how when a drug or substance gets associated with a segment of society where there are already negative perceptions and stereotypes about that population, it can change our perception of inanimate objects that we associate with that group. So the association with alcohol, particularly to the Irish, who were starting to immigrate into America in our northeastern cities in larger and larger numbers at the turn of the century, um, certainly changed some people's views of alcohol. And this contributed to the temperance movement, was the movement to ban or prohibit alcohol. And it's worth noting that this was a female dominated movement. And you see here a little. A little kind of ad where it says lips that touch liquor shall not touch ours. And if you wonder why this was a female dominated movement, it had a lot to do with the role of women in society at that time, the fact that they were seen as being kind of the caretakers of the home, associated with like the sanctity and the security of the home, and the fact that a lot of women did not work, or if they did work, they did not enjoy the same work opportunities as men, which made them dependent on men. So the fact that they felt as if alcohol made men worse husbands, less reliable providers, worse fathers, this motivated a lot of women to participate in this movement. And this movement enjoyed much success, first on the local and state level, and then it grew in prominence until the 18th Amendment was passed in 1920, which established prohibition, where basically the sale and consumption of alcohol was prohibited. Now, we look back at that as being kind of a massive failure because it did not really stop most people from imbibing. It just meant it was underground and now illegal. And it gave organized crime syndicates more wealth and power than ever before. And in a lot of cities, it increased violent crime rates as these crime syndicates kind of fought for control over the illegal alcohol trade. And so, just 13 years after the 18th Amendment was passed, the 21st Amendment was passed, and this ended prohibition. And now, of course, we generally, don't even think have these kind of strong negative associations with alcohol. It's a routine part of a lot of people socializing. Think about the fact that we sell beer and wine at a lot of venues. People have alcoholic beverages with everything from brunch to dates to work dinners. Even in a state like North Carolina where you can't buy hard liquor in the grocery store, you can buy wine, you can buy beer, and there are plenty of states, of course, where you can buy liquor in your local Target. So it just kind of shows you how we've now normalized alcohol consumption, and it plays a rather large role in American social life. And so, if you think about especially alcohol use and tobacco use in particular, then this statistic that almost everyone uses some type of drug, legal or illegal, in America is not very surprising, because alcohol consumption alone in the past month among people 12 or older is over 50%. And even though, as you can see, cigarette consumption has declined in the last 20 years, still over 20% of Americans smoke cigarettes monthly. And you can see, illegal drugs are less commonly used. However, more than 28 million people have used some illegal drug at least once in the past 30 days. And particularly some illegal drugs, such as heroin, have seen a fairly dramatic increase in the last 5 to 7 years, as you can kind of see in that second graph. And it's worth noting that illegal drug use peaks in the late teens and then declines as people get older. Although, as your book talks about with prescription drug abuse, that does kind of complicate the picture a little bit, because that is an example of legal drugs being used illegally, and middle-aged people are more likely to engage in that type of behavior. So whether you're young, whether you're old, whether you're, we're talking about illegal drugs or legal drugs being used illegally. One thing that is of interest to people that study drug use is, why do people use drugs? And these uses can be kind of summed up in terms of like five categories. The most common reason, especially for legal drug use, is therapeutic uses. And honestly, even legal drugs being used illegally, this is still probably the main contributing factor. So people are using drugs to feel better, to heal themselves, to monitor a disease or disorder. So America is a country that relies on our prescription drugs in a variety of ways. But then the second most common reason for drug use is recreational use. And think about this with alcohol. It's we use it, we imbibe because it's fun, we enjoy it, it brings us some amount of pleasure. People also use drugs for spiritual or psychological uses, right? So to feel a particular way, to bring on a particular type of psychological sensation. People still use hallucinogens in particular to kind of achieve this effect, this kind of what elevated experience, I guess, that some people might would say. People use drugs as a form of escape. When gets hard, you don't want to deal with your problems. It's not even really so much that you're doing it for fun, so much as drugs allow people to momentarily forget or escape their problems, even if it's just temporarily. And then finally, social conformity. That especially like a drug like alcohol, where the use of it is fairly normative, people might partake just to fit in. Now, of course, when we're talking about drug use, this is not necessarily the same thing as drug abuse. So, what are the distinction between those terms? Well, unsurprisingly, you should note that there is a little bit of subjectivity to this distinction about what qualifies something as being drug abuse. But the criteria are that if you're violating accepted medical practice. So you're not using a legal drug the way that it was intended to be used. That's considered to be drug abuse. Or if your usage causes mental, physical, or social harm. And, as you can kind of see, that's for both of these criteria, there is a certain amount of subjective element here, because obviously medical practices can change over time. So, what is a violation in year 2020 maybe was not a violation in year 1980. And then, even something like causing harm, obviously, when we start speaking about addiction and dependency, which we'll talk about in a second, that's very clear. But, how much harm does something need to cause before it is in fact considered harmful? If you've ever drank too much and thrown up, obviously it's causing you some short-term harm. But is that really what's meant when we say physical harm? Now, obviously, if you drink to the point of vomiting on a regular basis, now, of course, we consider that to be a significant physical harm. But what does it look like in between those two kind of opposite ends of the spectrum? That's the part that can become a little bit subjective, and this can make it very difficult, of course, if you're concerned about someone's drug usage, to know exactly maybe when it's crossed over into abuse. So, two terms that can help us kind of objectively establish harm are the terms addiction and dependency. Um, Addiction is when you have a physical or psychological craving for a drug. And you know that you have a craving for the drug because you experience withdrawal symptoms when you stop taking said drug. For instance, I definitely have a caffeine addiction. I started drinking way too much coffee probably in high school, but certainly by the time I was in college, um, and grad school, my addiction had gotten much stronger. So when I don't have coffee, like if I'm on vacation or I sleep in and I don't have my normal, 2 to 3 cups within the first couple of hours of me being awake, I get a very, very bad headache. And like a full blown migraine. And normally, if I don't get caffeine in my system very quickly after developing that headache, I usually find that I can't even really, go about my daily activities. And that's because I do have a full blown addiction to caffeine. Dependency is a state in which a person's body has adjusted to the regular use of the drug. And so a person can be dependent without being addicted. Dependency just suggests that, you need to continue to use the drug in order to feel comfortable. And oftentimes the two do go together, but they are not considered to be synonyms. Just note that, although people might use the terms interchangeably, they are not necessarily referring to the same thing. And dependency also can refer not just to your physical kind of dependence on a drug, but also kind of your psychological dependence. And if you have a psychological dependence, then, it's not like you will necessarily experience physical symptoms when your usage stops. So it's not the same thing as a physical addiction, but certainly the psychological dependence can be just as real as the physical dependence can be. And so now I'm coming to where this video is going to stop. If you're looking at your slides, you can see that I have slides for all 6 of these major types of drugs: stimulants, depressants, hallucinogens, cannabis, steroids, and prescription drugs. And the fact that I am not covering it via video does not mean that you do not need to know it. It just means that I would largely be repeating a lot of the same information that's already in your textbook. So at this point, I am going to encourage you, if you have not read those pages carefully, to make sure that you are reading those pages carefully. And my second video will pick up with discussing the social problems that are correlated with drug use.